Okay, we're in this section in the book of Exodus, which is often referred to as the Book of the Covenant. And it really begins in chapter 20 at verse 22, and then goes through to the end of chapter 23, the last verse of chapter 23, because this is all continuously God speaking here. These are the words of God the words of the Lord that he spoke to Moses. So we have this continuous account here in which God is giving these instructions or laws, various commandments concerning different situations and circumstances that Israel would face. They're in the infancy, really, of being a nation. They're not yet in a land of their own. And so God is preparing them for that time. And as any country needs to have laws, and there needs to be a rule of law by which society is governed. So God is providing that here in these verses. There will, of course, be more laws and instructions that God will give later, as we see in like the book of Leviticus, and then in Deuteronomy, there's further other laws and expansions upon the various things that God is saying here. But here we've seen, as we saw last week, there were some laws or instructions concerning slavery at the beginning of chapter 21. There were laws relating to murder or manslaughter, different depending on the circumstances. There were various non-capital offences, like if an injury was caused and compensation that would have to be paid. Various laws concerning property and the use of other people's property and the compensation that would have to be paid if something was lost or damaged in some way. So all of these are in place so that society can function properly. And we pick up the account here in chapter 22 at verse 16, and between chapter 22 verse 16 and into chapter 23 and verse 9, we have a series of moral and ethical instructions being given here. And the first one here in verses 16 and 17 of chapter 22 says this: if a man seduces a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall give the marriage present for her and make her his wife. If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equivalent to the marriage present for virgins. So this is relating to a situation where a man has seduced an unbetrothed virgin, a young girl, a young woman who's not betrothed. A betrothal was a binding agreement to marry, similar to an engagement that we have in our culture, but more binding than an engagement. Once those who were betrothed could only be released from that through a divorce. So it's really the step prior to the marriage itself. But in this case, the young lady concerned is not betrothed, so she's not bound to anyone in marriage, but she is seduced by this man, and he lies with her. And in those circumstances, then, if that occurs, the man had to give the marriage present for her and marry her. So this would be the payment of the bridal price or the dowry, which would be paid to the young girl's father. So if he has done this, then he has to pay the bridal price and he has to marry her. However, if the girl's father refuses to give her in marriage, and he has the right to do that, the one who has committed this offence still has to pay the bridal price, the dowry. He shall pay a money equivalent to the marriage present for virgins. So in this way, although it may seem strange or doesn't really fit in with our culture, but in this way, it is affording some protection to the young woman here, that she is, if she has been placed in this situation, it would be difficult for her to get married. And so in this case, she is, the man who has committed this against her is required to marry her and to pay that dowry. So in a way, it is protecting her interests in some way there. There's a repeat of this law given in the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 22, verses 28 and 29. Which gives the price here, the bridal price that's to be paid. If a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed and seizes her and lies with her, and they're found, then the man who lay with her shall give to the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he has violated her. He may not put her away all her days. So again, we see the protection that is given to the young woman there under those circumstances. There is an example of this happening situation in Genesis chapter 34, verses 1 to 12. And of course, this is long before the time of Moses. This concerns Jacob's daughter Dinah. She's the daughter of Leah and Jacob. And she goes in, visits the people in the land, and there's this man named Shechem who seizes her and lies with her, in fact rapes her really, but he wants to marry her. And they get into some family discussion here over the payment of the price and that. And verse 12 of Genesis 34 says, um, this is Shechem who's trying to persuade Jacob that he wants to marry Dinah. So Shechem said to her father, that's to Jacob, and to her brothers, "Let me find favor in your eyes, and whatever you say to me I will give. Ask of me ever so much as a marriage present and gift, and I will give according as you say to me. Only give me the maiden to be my wife." So Shechem there is willing to. He loves her and he wants to marry her, and he's willing to pay that price. You can read on to see how that story turns out, which isn't a very nice story anyway. But that's the sort of example of how this thing worked. Well, moving on from there, in back in Exodus chapter 22, verses 18 to 20. Now we have a series of 3 crimes which were punishable by death. You shall not permit a sorceress to live. Whoever lies with the beast shall be put to death. Whoever sacrifices to any god, save to the Lord only, shall be utterly destroyed. So sorcery is those involved in sorcery or witchcraft or the occult practices, they were to be put to death. King Saul had implemented this law in 1 Samuel. We can see in 1 Samuel chapter 28. And Saul himself wants to go and consult a medium here in 1 Samuel chapter 28 and verse 3. No, verse 9. Verse 9, 1 Samuel 28, verse 9. So Saul is wanting to go and consult Samuel, who's already dead. So he goes to find this medium, and he says to her, he goes and disguises himself. He says to her, "Divine for me by a spirit, and bring up for me whomever I shall name for you." The woman said to him, "Surely you know that what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the wizards from the land. Why then are you laying a snare for my life to bring about my death?" So Saul had implemented this law there in Israel at that time, but he wants to break it himself here, we see in that case. And down in verse 30, yeah, that's I think that's it. Yeah. So Samuel is conjured up. So Saul sort of bypasses that law there in that situation. Lying with a beast there is another offence punishable by death, and sacrificing to any other god. And these things would have been commonly practiced in the land of Canaan when the people go into the land there. So provision is made there for these offences there. In verse 21 to 27, we have a series of laws concerning the treatment of strangers, widows, orphans, and the poor. So these are the vulnerable and the weaker groups in society. So verse 21 says, "You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not afflict any widow or orphan. If you do afflict them and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless." So protection is given here to these vulnerable groups in society. And concerning the stranger there, you shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him. The people are reminded that they were in that situation themselves when they were in Egypt. You were strangers in the land of Egypt. You know what it's like to be a stranger in a foreign land. So this is why they are to show concern for strangers. Then verse 25 says, "If you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor, you shall not be to him as a creditor, and you shall not exact interest from him." So you can lend some money to someone who is struggling, who is poor, but don't charge them interest. That will just make things more difficult for them. We know how difficult it is for people these days. If people are poor and they take out a loan, or perhaps they have to go to a loan shark and they're charged exorbitant interest rates. So here again, we see the protection of those who are in this vulnerable position. And verse 26 says, "If ever you take your neighbour's garment in pledge, you shall restore it to him before the sun goes down, for that is his only covering. It is his mantle for his body. In what else shall he sleep? And if he cries to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate." So here's a situation where someone, a poor person, is loaned some money, and as a guarantee, he gives his cloak or his garment to the person who's lent him the money. That's his pledge. But the person isn't allowed to keep that garment through the night. He has to return it because the man needs the garment to keep warm at night time. So again, it's providing that protection so that those who are poor, who are in difficult circumstances, are not being exploited. And the basis of that is the Lord says that he is compassionate. If he cries to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. The Lord is a compassionate God. Then in verse 28, another instruction here: "You shall not revile God, nor curse a ruler of your people." We have an example of the misuse of this law, really, in 1 Kings chapter 21. This is the story of King Ahab, who wanted to take Naboth's vineyard. And Naboth wasn't willing to let him have it. 1 Kings chapter 21. So Ahab wants to take Naboth's vineyard and offers to buy it. Naboth doesn't want to sell it to him, so Ahab goes into a sulk about it. His wife Jezebel says, "Well, you're the king, you can do whatever you want." And so they bring some false charges against Naboth here in verse 10. Verse 9, "She wrote in the letters, proclaim a fast and set Naboth on high among the people, and set two base fellows opposite him, and let him bring a charge against him, saying, you have cursed God and the king." So this is the charge, the false charge that is made against Naboth here, that he has cursed God and the king. And that's how they execute Naboth in the end there. So there's a misuse of that law here from Exodus. "You shall not revile God nor curse a ruler of your people." The verse is also referred to by the Apostle Paul in Acts chapter 23 and verse 5. Acts chapter 23 and verse 5. Paul is here standing before the Jewish Sanhedrin, and the high priest Ananias has just commanded that those who stood by Paul to strike him on the mouth. And then in verse 3, Paul says to him, God shall strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law? And yet, contrary to the law, you order me to be struck. And then those who stood by said, would you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. So Paul quotes this verse here from Exodus there when he says that you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Verse 29 to verse 31 back in Exodus chapter 22 now has laws concerning consecration, the first fruits of the harvest and the firstborn of man and the firstborn of beast. All of these are consecrated to God or belong to God. And then verse 31 says, you shall be men consecrated to me. Therefore you shall not eat any flesh that is torn by beasts in the field. You shall cast it to the dogs. So the prohibition there on eating that flesh is that uh, an animal that had been torn by beasts in the field would not have been killed in the correct manner and bled in the correct manner, and so it would be unclean, and perhaps other unclean animals had come in contact with it. So it's about consecration and cleanliness there. That sort of meat is only to be cast to the dogs there. So those laws there concerning that consecration. Into chapter 23 now, in verses 1 to 3, we have some laws concerning testimony and the perversion of justice. So verses 1 to 3 says, you shall not utter a false report, you shall not join hands with a wicked man to be a malicious witness, you shall not follow a multitude to do evil, nor shall you bear witness in a suit, turning aside after a multitude so as to pervert justice, nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his suit. This is really an expansion on the ninth commandment in Exodus chapter 20, verse 16, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. So it's important for justice to be done, for fairness. So these sort of false reports or incorrect testimony is not to be accepted, and also not to be partial to a poor man in his suit. It might be an inclination, well, to show favoritism to the poor person. Well, that's not to happen either, that everyone is to be treated the same under the law in that way. And then verses 4 and 5, we have uh, how to treat your enemy if he needs help. If you meet your enemy's ox or his ass going astray, you shall bring it back to him. If you see the ass of one who hates you lying under its burden, you shall refrain from leaving him with it. You shall help him to lift it up. So it's showing respect and help to other people for their property if they're in trouble, and even if they're your enemy, you don't leave them. You go there and help them with what they need at that time. Go and help them to recover their ox or their ass, or to help lift them up if they've fallen under a burden. So, principle there of showing help and kindness. Even to your enemies. Verses 6 to 8 returns really to some further laws concerning justice again, as in the first three verses. You shall not pervert the justice due to your poor in his suit. Keep far from a false charge, and do not slay the innocent and righteous, for I will not acquit the wicked. And you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the officials and subverts the cause of those who are in the right. So again, there we see the importance of justice. No bribes to be taken. This was one of the charges made against Samuel's sons in 1 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 3. They had been accepting bribes. So we're given the names of his sons in verse 2, Samuel's sons, and then verse 3 says, yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Contrast to that is Samuel himself. 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 3, Samuel, speaking to the people here, asks them, here am I, testify against me before the Lord and before his anointed. Whose ox have I taken, or whose ass have I taken, or whom have I defrauded? Whom have I oppressed, or from whose hand have I taken a bribe to blind my eyes with it? Testify against me, and I will restore it to you. And they said, you have not defrauded us, or oppressed us, or taken anything from any man's hand. So Samuel, different in character to his sons in that regard. Then in verse 9, there's concern again for those who are strangers. In verse 9, chapter 23 of Exodus, you shall not oppress a stranger. You know the heart of a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Again, a reminder to them there of the situation that they had been in Egypt. So they were to show some empathy towards strangers. Then in chapter 23, verses 10 to 19, we have some instructions and laws relating to ceremonies and festivals. In verses 10 and 11, there's a law regarding the sabbatical year. For 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield, but the seventh year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the wild beasts may eat. You shall do likewise with your vineyard and with your olive orchard. So after 6 years of sowing and harvesting, the land was to be left to lie fallow so that it would recover. And the purpose here of this is to allow the poor people to glean from those fields. So the poor could go into those fields, and whatever was there, they would be free to take that. And once they've been and taken what they've wanted, then wild animals can go and get the food from there as well. That applies to vineyards and olive orchards as well. We see in Leviticus chapter 25, this law is referred to again. In Leviticus chapter 25, verses 20 to 22. If you say, what shall we eat in the seventh year, if we may not sow or gather in our crops? So if they're supposed to leave the field fallow in the seventh year, people are wondering, well, what are we going to eat then in the seventh year? So what shall we eat in the seventh year if we may not sow or gather in our crops? And then God says, I will command my blessing upon you in the sixth year, so that it will bring forth fruit for 3 years. So the sixth year would be particularly abundant and would provide for the next 3 years. When you sow in the eighth year, you will be eating old produce from the sixth year until the ninth year, when its produce comes in, and you shall eat the old. So God would make provision for the people so that there would be enough food during that time when that land was left to lie fallow. Verse 12, Exodus 23, is another repetition of the Sabbath law It's given in as one of the Ten Commandments back in that Exodus chapter 20. And here the reason given for the Sabbath day is that it's given for physical rest for man and animal so that they may be refreshed. Verse 12 says, 6 days you shall do your work, but on the seventh day you shall rest, that your ox and your ass may have rest, and the son of your bondmaid and the alien may be refreshed. So again, it's showing concern for people's well-being, that they should have a day of rest, a day free from having to work. Verse 13 mentions there that the names of other gods were not to be mentioned or heard. Perhaps that's referring to swearing by the names of other gods, something which would indicate a lack of faith or trust in the true God, in the Lord there. And then in verses 14 to 17, there's mention now of three festivals that were to be observed. And the first of these, in verse 14, is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. 3 times in the year you shall keep a feast to me. You shall keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread, as I commanded you. You shall eat unleavened bread for 7 days at the appointed time in the month of Abib, for in it you came out of Egypt. None shall appear before me empty-handed. The Feast of Unleavened Bread lasted for 7 days. The month of Abib is early spring, March, April time, and it's connected to the Passover. The Passover was one day, and then that was followed by the 7 days of the unleavened bread. And then the second feast mentioned is the Feast of Harvest in verse 16. You shall keep the Feast of Harvest of the first fruits of your labor of what you sow in the field. In the New Testament, the Feast of Harvest is called Pentecost. Pentecost is a Greek word meaning 50. In Exodus chapter 34, verse 22, it's called the Feast of Weeks, because it was observed 7 weeks, or roughly 50 days, after the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then the third one is the Feast of Ingathering, which is also referred to as the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Booths. And the Feast of Ingathering was celebrated in the 7th month, equivalent to around October time in the autumn, and it was observed for 7 days. And these 3 feasts were to be observed by all males in Israel. In New Testament times, we see Jesus and his family observing these. Jesus, when he was a 12-year-old boy, went with his parents to Jerusalem for the Passover. We see Jesus in another occasion in John chapter 2 going for the Passover, and in chapter 7 going to the Feast of Tabernacles. And these festivals would provide a time of fellowship for the people and a time of unity, of bringing people together in the celebration of these things. This chart here shows this includes other ones as well, but the ones we've mentioned here, the unleavened bread and the first fruits or Pentecost, there in the month of Nisan. Nisan is a name for the first month, which replaced the name Abib. Abib is used here, but after the people came back from exile, some of the names of the months were changed. So yeah, it's equivalent to our March, April time. And then Tabernacles, the Feast of Tabernacles, or Ingathering as it's called here, occurring in Tishri, which is around October time. So those were the 3 important festivals that are mentioned briefly here. The more details of them are given in other places as well. Some restrictions were placed upon some of these things here in verses 18 and 19. The blood of the sacrifice was not to be offered with leavened bread. Leaven was often used as a symbol of corruption or sin. And we see that in the Feast of Unleavened Bread or the Passover, leaven had to be cleaned out of the house on that occasion. The fat of the sacrifice was not to be left until the morning. The fat was to be burnt, wasn't to be eaten. If it's left till the morning, it may have gone off. Uh, Likewise, with the Passover sacrifice, that was to be nothing was of that was to be left. It was to be burnt by the morning as well. And then the first of the first fruits of the harvest. So the very first things harvested, these were dedicated to the Lord and taken into the house of the Lord. And then this rather odd, strange instruction: you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Um, no reason is given here, but a suggestion is that it was another practice of the Canaanites, that somehow it involved some sort of practice involving the Canaanites, perhaps some sort of ritual that they used that for, and that's led even to today, where Orthodox Jews will not mix milk and meat dishes, and they even keep separate kitchens, one kitchen for milk and dairy dishes, and another separate kitchen for meat. So keeping the two separate there. In chapter 23, from verse 20 to verse 33, we have some instructions regarding the occupation of the land now. So God promises to send an angel before the Israelites to guard them and lead them into the promised land. In verses 20 and 21, behold, I send an angel before you to guard you on the way and to bring you to the place which I have prepared. Give heed to him and hearken to his voice. Do not rebel against him, for he will not pardon your transgression, for my name is in him. So God making that provision there to guide the people to the land, and the people not to rebel against the angel, because God's name is in him. So he's God's messenger. He has God's authority. He's God's representative. Um, if the people will listen to the voice of the angel, if they're obedient to God, then God will be an enemy to their enemies and an adversary to their adversaries. And then in verses 23 and 24, when the angel brings the people into the land occupied by the nations listed there, the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hivites, and Jebusites, God will blot out these nations. And the Israelites are forbidden to bow down to their gods or to serve them. They're to overthrow their pillars, which objects of worship, and to break them in pieces. So again, we see God's promise to bless the people if they are obedient to him. In verse 25, you shall serve the Lord your God, and I will bless your bread and your water, and I will take sickness away from the midst of you. None shall cast her young or be barren in your land. I will fulfill the number of your days. So God promising these physical and material blessings for the people if they are obedient to him, if they serve him. But before the people enter the land, verse 27, now God says that he will send his terror before them to throw their enemies into confusion. I will send my terror before you and throw into confusion all the people against whom you shall come, and I will make all your enemies turn their backs to you. And then in verse 28, God says that he will send hornets before them. I will send hornets before you, which shall drive out Hivite, Canaanite, and Hittite from before you. The hornets here have been understood in different ways. So this is repeated actually in Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse 20, that God's going to send these hornets. Moreover, the Lord your God will send hornets among them until those who are left and hide themselves from you are destroyed. And then in Joshua chapter 24 and verse 12. And I and I sent the hornet before you, which drove them out before you, the two kings of the Amorites. It was not by your sword or by your bow. So what are these hornets then? They could actually be hornets, plague or swarms of hornets, which uh, affected the people in the land and caused them to flee. Or it might be speaking figuratively or metaphorically to refer to a plague or an attacker. And one suggestion is that the hornets are referring to the Egyptian army and the Egyptians. Prior to Israel leaving Egypt, the Egyptians carried out a number of campaigns in the land of Canaan, so perhaps weakening the people in Canaan in preparation for God to bring his own people into the land there. So that's a possibility. Or it may refer to the terror that's just been mentioned in the previous verse and the panic that God caused to come upon the inhabitants of the land. And we can see that in Joshua chapter 5 and verse 1. Which says, when all the kings of the Amorites that were beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites that were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan for the people of Israel until they had crossed over, their heart melted, and there was no longer any spirit in them because of the people of Israel. So the inhabitants of the land, when they understood what God was doing, how God had brought the Israelites out of Egypt and brought them into the land, their hearts melted. So perhaps that's part of this as well. To verse 29 and 30, we see that God is not going to drive out the inhabitants quickly in 1 year, but rather little by little, he says. I will not drive them out from before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the wild beasts multiply against you. Little by little, I will drive them out from before you until you are increased and possess the land. So it will be a gradual occupation of the land, not in one go, that all the inhabitants will be driven out in one go, but it will be done piece by piece, little by little. Otherwise, is that if it will be left desolate if everyone leaves at once, no one's around, and then the wild animals will come in. Bit like during our lockdowns when no one was going around and the wild animals were coming into town. There are stories of deer and sheep and goats going into towns because the towns were empty of people. And that would have been the situation here as well if God had driven everyone out. So it's a gradual, God is preparing for a gradual occupation of the land, little by little. Verse 31 there gives the boundaries of the land that God is going to give them. I will set your bounds from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines and from the wilderness to the Euphrates, for I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. So this is the land, the extent of the land that God is promising to give to give Israel, going from the border in the south there with Egypt, the Mediterranean coast, all the way up north to the Euphrates. That's the extent of the land that God promised, made the promise to Abraham back in Genesis chapter 15, which is repeated here with the boundaries. This map shows the allocation of the land to the different tribes according to Numbers chapter 34. The full extent of that land, or the green area, was only ever really attained very briefly during the reigns of King David and King Solomon. The people never occupied permanently the whole of that land that God had promised to give them. Then verse 32 and 33 at the end of chapter 23 there, we see that the Israelites are not to make any covenants with the inhabitants of the land or their gods. And if the inhabitants of the land are allowed to remain, they would lead the Israelites into sin against God. So you shall make no covenant with them or with their gods. They shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. So it would cause trouble for Israel if they did this. But of course, that is what does happen. They don't drive out the people completely, and there are problems as we see from the book of Judges in Judges chapter 2. Verse 11 says, "And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals, and they forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were round about them, and bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They forsook the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth." So we see the problems that arose for Israel throughout their subsequent history, really, is that falling away and worshipping other gods as well. So chapter 23, the end of chapter 23 there marks the end of this book of the covenant. And then the next chapter here, chapter 24, deals with Israel's acceptance of the covenant. So verses 1 to 11, here the words of God have now ended at verse 33, and then verses 1 to 11, the words that were spoken by God there were to be recorded in the book of the covenant. So verse 4 says, "And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord." And then verse 7 says, "Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people." So the book was written, Moses recorded it, and it's read in the hearing of the people, and they commit themselves to obey the words of God. Verse 3 there, they say, Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the ordinances, and all the people answered with one voice and said, "All the words which the Lord has spoken, we will do." So they commit themselves to obey. And then verse 7 again, "Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, 'All that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient.'" Moses then took blood from sacrifices that had been offered, and half of this blood he threw against the altar. He built an altar, we're told, at the foot of the mountain, Mount Sinai, and also 12 pillars were erected, one representing each of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so the young men there offer these burnt offerings and peace offerings of oxen, and Moses takes half of the blood, which he puts in basins, and half of the blood he threw against the altar. And then the other half of the blood he throws upon the people. So the blood here demonstrates the sealing or the acceptance of the covenant. It's sort of it's a binding agreement through the blood that is thrown on the altar, but also thrown upon the people as well. And we see a comparison with this with Jesus' sacrifice and Jesus speaking of his own blood being the blood of the new covenant, so that his blood seals that new covenant. Moses and Aaron and Aaron's two eldest sons, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel then went up the mountain. Verse 1 of chapter 24 says, the Lord says to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship afar off. Moses alone shall come near to the Lord, but the others shall not come near, and the people shall not come up with him." And then verse 9 says, "Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God and ate and drank." So they go up the mountain, and they see this vision of God described there as this They saw the God of Israel, and under his feet this pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And they survived. God didn't lay his hands upon them. They beheld God. They saw the glory of God there, and they ate and drank. So they had this meal, a fellowship meal or covenant meal, really again to emphasize the binding of this covenant upon the people, sharing that meal. Again, I see a parallel with the Lord's Supper that we take, being a covenant meal, that covenant that we are in with God. And then the second part of chapter 24, we have Moses then receiving the tables of stone. Moses was called by God to go up on the mountain, to wait and to receive the tables of stone with the law and the commandment written by God. And Moses took with him Joshua, his servant, his assistant, whilst the elders were left to wait. Aaron and Hur were to remain with the people, and they were to deal with any problems or any issues that the people would bring to them. We see there in verses 13 and 14. So then for 6 days, the cloud of the glory of the Lord descended upon the mountain and remained on the mountain, covered the mountain. And then on the seventh day, God spoke to Moses from the cloud. And then Moses remained on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. And during that time, God would be revealing to Moses further instructions, particularly concerning the tabernacle, the building of the tabernacle, and the priesthood, and all of that. The glory of the Lord there is described as being like a devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel. So the people below could see it, but it's Moses himself who is up there on the top of the mountain in the midst of all of that. So he entered the cloud and he remained there for 40 days. He makes another reference to this in Deuteronomy chapter 9, verses 9 to 11. When he's recalling this, he says, when I went up the mountain to receive the tables of stone, the tables of the covenant which the Lord made with you, I remained on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. I neither ate bread nor drank water. And the Lord gave me the 2 tables of stone written with the finger of God, and on them were all the words which the Lord had spoken with you on the mountain out of the midst of the fire on the day of the assembly. So Moses says there that the stones were written with the finger of God. God had written upon those stones there. So we'll leave that this point.